The thermometer outside read -38 degrees. But inside Thomas Brennan's cabin, the temperature held steady at 16 degrees above zero. A 54-degree difference that defied every principle his neighbors understood about frontier survival. The secret wasn't a better fireplace or thicker walls, but something so simple that when he first proposed it, the entire trading post had laughed him out of the supply room. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. Thomas Brennan had survived 6 winters in the northern Montana Territory, and that fact alone placed him among a rare breed of men. The winter of 1873 marked his 7th season in the mountains, trapping beaver and marten along the tributaries that fed into the Flathead River. He was 31 years old, lean from constant work, and possessed the kind of quiet competence that came from learning through experience rather than instruction. His hands bore the scars of axe work, frostbite, and the occasional miscalculation with steel traps. His face showed the permanent squint of a man who spent his days reading snow conditions and animal tracks. Thomas had built his cabin in the autumn of 1867, selecting a site on a slight rise with good drainage and timber access. The structure followed standard mountain construction methods. He had notched 42 logs at the corners, chinked the gaps with moss and clay, installed a single door facing south, and cut one small window on the eastern wall. The cabin measured 12 feet by 14 feet inside, with a dirt floor and a stone fireplace he had constructed over 3 weeks of careful work. A sleeping platform raised 18 inches off the ground occupied one corner. Shelves lined 2 walls. Hooks held his traps, snowshoes, and extra clothing. The entire structure had taken him 26 days to complete working alone. It was adequate. The fireplace drew well, keeping smoke from filling the interior. The roof, made from split cedar shakes layered over pole rafters, kept out rain and snow. The door fit snugly enough to block most drafts. Thomas had winterized the cabin each autumn by packing additional moss into any gaps that had opened during the summer, checking the chimney for bird nests or debris, and stacking 2 cords of firewood against the north wall outside. These preparations had kept him alive through 6 winters, some mild, some brutally cold. He was a careful man by nature. His trap lines were methodically placed and regularly checked. His supplies were inventoried and rationed. He maintained his equipment with the attention that prevented small problems from becoming dangerous failures. Other trappers who worked the same region considered Thomas reliable, if somewhat reserved. He had partnered with various men over the years for specific tasks that required 2 people, but he preferred working alone. Solitude suited him. He found satisfaction in the rhythmic patterns of wilderness life, the cycle of seasons, the predictable behavior of animals, the straightforward relationship between effort and result. By December of 1873, Thomas had laid his trap lines and settled into his winter routine. He checked traps every 3rd day, processed pelts in the cabin, and maintained his equipment during the long, dark hours. His food supplies were adequate: dried meat, beans, flour, coffee, and salt. His ammunition was sufficient. His firewood was stacked and ready. Everything suggested another successful winter season. He had no reason to expect that the next 3 months would fundamentally change how he understood survival in the mountains. Thomas's younger brother Daniel had arrived in late November of 1873. At 26 years old, Daniel was following the path Thomas had taken 7 years earlier, leaving behind a failing farm in Wisconsin to try his fortune in the fur trade. Thomas had agreed to teach him the basics during the winter months, when trapping was slower and the lessons wouldn't interfere with the critical work of the season. Daniel would stay until spring, learn the skills he needed, then establish his own camp the following autumn. The arrangement worked well initially. Daniel was strong, willing to learn, and didn't complain about the harsh conditions. Thomas showed him how to set traps, read animal sign, and process pelts without damaging the fur. They fell into a comfortable routine, sharing the cabin's limited space and taking turns with daily tasks. Daniel slept on the floor near the fireplace, while Thomas kept his sleeping platform. The cabin felt smaller with 2 men inside, but it remained functional. On January 9, 1874, the temperature dropped with unusual speed. Thomas had seen cold snaps before, but this one descended like a physical weight. By evening, the air outside was so cold it hurt to breathe. Thomas kept the fire burning steadily, feeding split wood into the fireplace every hour. Inside the cabin, their breath formed clouds. Water in the bucket near the door developed a skin of ice despite being only 6 feet from the fire. The logs of the cabin cracked and popped as the wood contracted in the extreme cold. Daniel complained of feeling cold around midnight. Thomas added more wood to the fire, building it higher than usual. The fireplace roared, consuming wood at an alarming rate, but the cabin's interior remained brutally cold. Thomas could see frost forming on the inner surface of the door. The single window, covered with oiled paper, had ice crystals growing across it. He pulled extra blankets from his storage and gave them to Daniel, who wrapped himself tightly and tried to sleep. Thomas stayed awake, feeding the fire constantly. He burned through wood that should have lasted 3 days, pushing the fireplace to its maximum output. The area directly in front of the hearth was warm, almost hot, but 3 feet away the cold was overwhelming. Heat rose to the ceiling and seemed to vanish. The walls, despite being solid logs chinked with clay, offered no real barrier against the cold outside. Around 4 in the morning, Thomas noticed Daniel had stopped shivering. He crossed the cabin quickly and shook his brother's shoulder. Daniel didn't respond. Thomas pulled back the blankets and felt for a pulse at Daniel's neck. His brother's skin was cold, far too cold. Thomas worked frantically, dragging Daniel closer to the fire, rubbing his limbs, trying to force warmth back into his body. But Daniel Brennan had frozen to death, 6 feet from a roaring fire, inside a cabin, wrapped in 3 wool blankets. Thomas buried Daniel when the ground thawed enough to dig in early March. He marked the grave with stones and spent 3 days sitting beside it, trying to understand what had happened. The facts were simple and terrible. His brother had frozen to death inside a cabin with a fire burning. The fireplace had been working properly. Thomas had fed it constantly throughout the night. The cabin had no obvious structural failures. Yet somehow, the cold had won. Other trappers who heard about Daniel's death accepted it as tragic but inevitable. Winter killed people. That was the reality of mountain life. Men froze crossing rivers, got caught in blizzards, or simply miscalculated their firewood supplies. Daniel's death was unfortunate, but not particularly unusual. Several trappers told Thomas that at least he had tried, that sometimes the cold was simply too powerful to fight. These condolences, meant to provide comfort, only deepened Thomas's frustration. He couldn't accept that explanation. The fire had been massive, consuming wood at 3 times the normal rate. The cabin had been sealed as tightly as possible. Thomas had done everything according to established practice, yet his brother had frozen anyway. The failure wasn't in Thomas's actions. It was in something fundamental about how mountain cabins worked, or, more accurately, how they failed to work. Thomas became obsessed with understanding heat. He started paying attention to how warmth moved through the cabin, how it seemed to gather near the ceiling and disappear, how the area around the fireplace could be almost painfully hot while the corners remained frozen. He noticed that on windy nights, the cabin felt colder even with the same fire burning. He observed that the logs themselves, despite being 8 inches thick, felt cold to the touch on the interior surface when the temperature outside dropped severely. He began a series of experiments that other trappers would have considered pointless. He hung wet cloth strips at different heights and locations inside the cabin, watching how quickly they froze. He placed tin cups of water at various distances from the fireplace and timed how long until ice formed. He built fires of different sizes and recorded how much wood each consumed versus how warm the cabin felt. He covered the window completely, then partially, then not at all, noting any temperature difference. The results confused him initially. Nothing he did seemed to make substantial difference. A bigger fire consumed more wood, but didn't proportionally increase warmth. Better chinking between logs helped slightly, but not enough to matter during extreme cold. Adding a second layer of covering to the window made almost no measurable difference. Every modification he attempted produced minimal results. The cabin remained fundamentally cold, regardless of what he tried. The breakthrough came on a morning in late March, when Thomas stepped outside to split firewood. The wind had picked up overnight, blowing steadily from the northwest. Inside the cabin, despite a fire that had burned all night, the temperature was barely tolerable. Thomas wore his heavy coat even while sitting near the hearth. But the moment he stepped outside into the wind, he understood something that would change everything. The wind wasn't just cold, it was actively stealing heat. Thomas could feel it pulling warmth from his exposed skin, could sense how it penetrated through his wool coat and layers of clothing. He stood still for several minutes, letting the wind hit him directly, then moved behind the cabin where the structure blocked the wind. The temperature outside was the same in both locations, but sheltered from the wind, the cold felt less intense, more manageable. Thomas returned to the cabin and sat near the fire, thinking. Wind moved constantly across the mountains. It flowed around the cabin, pressed against the walls, found every tiny gap and crack. Even when the cabin appeared sealed, wind was working against it, pulling heat through the logs themselves. Wood was not solid. It had grain, pores, microscopic channels that allowed air to pass through. The thicker the log, the slower the air movement, but it never stopped completely. He realized that his cabin, and every cabin built the same way, was engaged in a constant battle. The fireplace generated heat. The wind stole it. On calm days, the fireplace could win, keeping the interior reasonably warm. But on windy days, especially when combined with extreme cold, the fireplace lost. It didn't matter how much wood he burned. The wind worked faster than the fire, stripping away heat as quickly as it was produced. This explained why the area directly around the fireplace was warm, but the rest of the cabin remained cold. Heat radiated from the fire in all directions, but it never had time to warm the space before the wind pulled it away through the walls. The heat rose to the ceiling and vanished, escaping through the roof or being pulled through the upper logs by wind pressure. The cabin wasn't a container for warmth, it was a sieve, and wind was water pouring through it constantly. Thomas spent the next week testing his theory. He hung blankets against the interior walls on the windward side of the cabin during a storm. The cabin felt slightly warmer, but the blankets themselves became cold, showing that wind was still penetrating through the logs. He stuffed grass and moss into every crack he could find, packing the chinking as tightly as possible. It helped marginally, but wind still won during severe weather. He tried building a windbreak from stacked logs outside the cabin. It reduced the wind hitting the door but made no noticeable difference to the overall cabin temperature. Thomas began visiting other trappers' camps during his travels that spring, paying attention to their cabins with new purpose. He noticed that everyone faced the same problem. Men burned enormous quantities of wood trying to stay warm, yet their cabins remained barely habitable during cold snaps. Some trappers had built larger fireplaces, thinking more heat output was the solution. Others had constructed double walls with space between them, filling the gap with dried grass or moss. A few had even tried building their cabins partially underground, hoping earth would provide insulation. None of these approaches worked significantly better than standard construction. The trappers with larger fireplaces simply burned more wood while achieving similar interior temperatures. The double-wall cabins were warmer, but only by a few degrees, hardly worth the massive additional labor required to build them. Underground cabins stayed slightly warmer, but were dark, damp, and prone to flooding during spring thaw. Every trapper Thomas spoke with accepted that winter cabins would be cold, that survival meant enduring discomfort, and that occasional deaths from freezing were simply part of mountain life. Thomas couldn't accept that conclusion. There had to be a solution. He started thinking about animals and how they survived winter. Bears denned in caves or hollow trees, places that blocked wind completely. Beaver built lodges with thick walls and underwater entrances that trapped warm air inside. Even rabbits dug burrows that stayed warmer than the surface. The common element wasn't fire. Animals had no fire. It was complete protection from wind and the creation of dead air spaces that held warmth. He thought about buildings he had seen in towns. Wealthy families had houses that stayed genuinely warm in winter. Those structures had thick walls, often brick or stone, and multiple layers of construction. They were built close together, sharing walls, sheltering each other from wind. A house in the middle of a town block was warmer than an isolated farmhouse because surrounding buildings blocked wind from multiple directions. Thomas realized he was thinking about the problem wrong. He had been trying to make the cabin itself better, thicker walls, better chinking, bigger fireplace. But the cabin was only part of the system. The real problem was wind hitting the cabin directly, and the solution wasn't to make the cabin stronger. It was to stop wind from reaching the cabin at all. He needed something between the wind and his walls. Something that would take the punishment of wind while creating a protected zone around the cabin itself. The idea seemed obvious once he saw it clearly. He needed a barrier, a substantial windbreak that completely surrounded the cabin. Not just a simple log wall that wind could flow over and around, but something thick enough and tall enough to create a genuinely calm zone. The barrier needed to be close enough to the cabin to protect it, but far enough away to allow access and prevent moisture problems. It needed to be made from material he could obtain and work with using basic tools. Thomas spent 2 weeks in April considering different barrier materials. He thought about building a fence of vertical logs planted in the ground around the cabin's perimeter. That would require cutting at least 80 logs, stripping them, digging holes deep enough to set them firmly, and somehow keeping them stable through freeze-thaw cycles. The labor would be immense, and the logs would rot where they contacted soil, eventually failing. He considered stacking rocks to create a wall, but gathering enough stones and building walls 5 feet high around the entire cabin would take months, assuming he could even find enough suitable rocks nearby. He thought about piling snow against the cabin walls, creating artificial drifts that would block wind. That might work temporarily, but snow would melt in spring and need to be rebuilt each winter. He needed something permanent, something that would last for years without constant maintenance. Every material he considered had significant problems, either too difficult to obtain, too labor-intensive to work with, or too prone to deterioration. The solution needed to be simple, made from readily available materials, and within his ability to construct working alone. The answer came to him while he was splitting firewood in late April. He looked at the pile he had just created, 2 cords of split wood stacked against the north wall of his cabin, and suddenly saw it differently. The wood pile wasn't just fuel storage, it was structure, mass, and windbreak all combined. Split wood stacked properly was stable, allowed air circulation to prevent rot, and created a solid barrier. Most importantly, he already knew how to work with it, and the material was literally everywhere around him. Thomas walked around his cabin, visualizing a wall of stacked firewood surrounding the entire structure. Not just a simple pile against one wall, but a complete perimeter of split wood, stacked 4 or 5 feet high, creating a continuous barrier between the wind and his cabin walls. The gap between the firewood wall and the cabin would be 3 or 4 feet, enough space to walk around the structure, allowing air circulation while creating a sheltered zone. The firewood itself would serve double purpose: windbreak during winter and fuel supply that was conveniently located. He spent 3 days considering problems with the idea. Stacked firewood could collapse if not properly built. It might attract insects or create hiding places for predators. Rain could rot the wood before he used it. But as he thought through each concern, he found solutions. Proper stacking technique would prevent collapse. The open structure of split wood wouldn't provide shelter for animals. Rain would drain through rather than pooling, and the air circulation would dry the wood, actually improving it as fuel. The real question was whether it would work. Would a wall of firewood actually stop wind effectively enough to make a difference? Thomas didn't know, but the concept made intuitive sense. Wind hitting a solid wall like stone simply flowed over and around it, creating turbulence on the far side. But wind hitting a semi-porous barrier like stacked firewood would be broken up, slowed, and dispersed. Thomas traveled to the trading post at Flathead Lake in early May to sell his winter's furs and purchase supplies for the coming season. The trading post served as the social center for trappers and hunters working the northern Montana region. Men gathered there to trade, share news, and drink whiskey while swapping stories about the winter that had passed. Thomas normally kept to himself during these gatherings, conducting his business efficiently and leaving quickly. But this year, he found himself describing his idea to several other trappers. The reaction was immediate and uniformly negative. When Thomas explained his plan to build a complete wall of stacked firewood around his cabin, the first trapper laughed so hard he spit tobacco juice across the floor. Others joined in, slapping tables and making jokes. One man asked if Thomas planned to live inside a bonfire. Another suggested he was confusing a cabin with a funeral pyre. A third wondered aloud if Daniel's death had broken something in Thomas's mind, making him think crazy thoughts about firewood walls. Thomas tried to explain the reasoning: the wind barrier, the protected zone, the thermal mass of all that wood absorbing warmth during the day and releasing it at night. His explanations only made the laughter worse. The trappers pointed out that he would be stacking wood twice, once to build the wall and again after burning it to feed his fire. They questioned why anyone would waste weeks of labor building a structure from the very material it was meant to protect. They suggested he was making his cabin into a target, marking it from miles away with walls of wood that announced supplies were stored there. The trading post owner, a man named Henderson, who had lived in the territory for 20 years, pulled Thomas aside and spoke seriously. He said grief could make men do strange things, that losing Daniel had clearly affected Thomas's judgment. Henderson suggested Thomas should spend the summer in town, working for wages, recovering his mental balance before returning to the mountains. He warned that building elaborate structures instead of focusing on trapping was how men went broke and ended up leaving the territory in debt. Thomas listened to Henderson's advice and the other trappers' mockery, then quietly purchased the supplies he had come for. He bought extra axe heads, a new splitting wedge, and 2 iron draw knives for shaping wood. He purchased 60 pounds of salt pork, 50 pounds of beans, 20 pounds of coffee, and the other staples he would need. He paid for everything with his fur money, shouldered his pack, and walked out of the trading post without responding to the final jokes thrown at him. During the 3-day walk back to his cabin, Thomas thought carefully about what he was planning. The mockery hadn't changed his mind, but it had forced him to examine his reasoning more critically. Was he pursuing this idea because it made sense, or because he needed to do something, anything, to feel like Daniel's death had meaning? Thomas returned to his cabin in mid-May and immediately began working. The construction season in Montana was short, roughly late May through September, before autumn cold made outdoor labor difficult and winter made it impossible. He had 4 months to complete his firewood wall before the first serious snows arrived. The task ahead was immense, but Thomas approached it with the same methodical focus he applied to everything else. He would need approximately 12 cords of firewood to build a wall surrounding his cabin, more wood than he typically cut in an entire year. He started by selecting trees. Not every tree made good firewood, and for his purpose, Thomas needed specific characteristics. He wanted dense hardwoods that would burn hot and long, oak when he could find it, maple, ash, or birch. He avoided pine and other soft woods that burned quickly and created excessive smoke. He also needed trees that were relatively straight and free from major branches or rot, because splitting would be easier and the stacked wood would be more stable. He marked 63 trees in the forest surrounding his cabin, spacing his cuts to avoid creating large clearings that would alter drainage or wind patterns. Cutting trees by hand with a bow saw and axe was brutal work. Each tree took between 1 and 3 hours to fell, depending on diameter. Thomas worked from sunrise until he physically couldn't continue, usually 8 or 9 hours daily. He felled 4 to 6 trees per day, spending the first hour of each morning sharpening his saw and axe, because dull tools were dangerous and inefficient. After felling a tree, he limbed it, removing all branches and cutting the trunk into 8-foot sections that he could drag back to his cabin using a rope harness. By the end of May, Thomas had felled 22 trees and dragged them to his cabin site. The logs lay in rough piles, waiting to be split. He had blisters on his hands despite wearing leather gloves. His shoulders ached constantly from the repetitive motions of sawing and chopping. He had lost weight, burning more calories than even his substantial meals could replace. But he had lumber, raw material for the project ahead, and he was maintaining his schedule. June brought splitting work. Thomas used a splitting maul and wedges to turn logs into firewood. The process required reading each log's grain, finding natural crack lines, and applying force precisely. A good swing would split a log cleanly. A poor swing would embed the wedge uselessly, requiring extensive work to extract it and try again. Thomas had years of experience splitting firewood for winter fuel, but the quantity he needed now was different. He wasn't splitting a few cords for heating. He was processing enough wood to build a structure. He developed a rhythm. Split from sunrise until noon, then rest during the hottest part of the day while he ate and maintained his tools. Resume splitting in late afternoon until darkness made the work dangerous. Stack the split pieces each evening, organizing them by size. The piles of split firewood grew steadily. By the end of June, Thomas had processed 8 of his felled trees completely, creating roughly 2 cords of split wood. He was behind schedule, but not catastrophically so. Thomas began construction of the actual firewood wall in early July. He had spent 3 days planning the layout, walking around his cabin with a rope to mark the perimeter where the wall would stand. The distance from cabin to firewood wall needed to be consistent, wide enough to allow him to walk around the structure with space to work, but narrow enough that the wall would effectively shelter the cabin. He settled on 3.5 feet, measured from the cabin's log walls to the inner face of the firewood stack. He drove stakes into the ground at 10-foot intervals around the perimeter, creating guides to keep the wall straight. The stakes wouldn't remain permanently. They were temporary references to maintain alignment during construction. Thomas planned to build the wall in sections, completing one portion before moving to the next, rather than raising all four sides simultaneously. This approach would let him refine his technique as he worked and prevent the entire project from becoming overwhelming. The first section was the north wall, the side that faced the prevailing winter winds. Thomas started at the northeast corner and began stacking. He placed the largest, most stable pieces at the bottom as a foundation. Each piece was positioned with split face down for stability, bark side out for weather resistance. He overlapped the pieces like bricks, ensuring each row locked the row beneath it. The pattern was similar to traditional masonry. No vertical seams aligned between rows, distributing weight and preventing collapse. The work was tedious and physically demanding. Each piece of firewood needed to be selected for fit, carried to position, and placed carefully. Thomas developed a feel for which pieces belonged where, how to fill gaps, and how to maintain level rows as the wall rose. The first 5 feet of wall took him 3 days to build. It stood solid, roughly 4 feet high, and effectively blocked wind when Thomas stood behind it. The success of this first section proved the concept could work. He continued around the perimeter. The west wall went faster because he had refined his technique. The south wall, facing away from prevailing winds, still needed to be built to complete the enclosure. The east wall presented challenges because the terrain sloped slightly, requiring Thomas to adjust his foundation to maintain level stacking. He worked through July and into August, cutting more trees as needed, splitting constantly, and stacking methodically. By mid-August, Thomas had completed 3/4 of the perimeter wall. The structure was beginning to look like what he had envisioned, a complete wooden fortress surrounding his cabin. The gap between cabin and wall created a protected walkway around the entire building. Thomas could move around his cabin sheltered from wind, accessing the door and window without exposure to weather. The wall itself was substantial. Thousands of pounds of split wood stacked to chest height, creating a genuine barrier. Other trappers who passed through the area that summer stopped to stare. Some made jokes. Others asked practical questions about stability and collapse risk. A few admitted the structure was impressive, even if they didn't understand why Thomas was building it. Thomas didn't explain. He simply continued working. Thomas completed the firewood wall on September 4th, 1874. The structure formed a complete perimeter around his cabin, standing 4 feet 6 inches high at its lowest point and 5 feet 2 inches at its highest. He had used approximately 11 cords of split firewood, representing 61 trees and 4 months of labor. The wall was stable, well constructed, and created a genuinely sheltered zone around his cabin. Standing inside the perimeter, Thomas could feel the difference. Wind that had previously hit the cabin directly was now broken up, slowed, and dispersed by the firewood barrier. He spent the next 2 weeks making final adjustments. He created 3 access gaps in the wall, each 2 feet wide, positioned at strategic points around the perimeter. These gaps allowed him to carry supplies in and out without climbing over the wall, but they were narrow enough that wind couldn't flow through them effectively. He also built a simple gate for the main entrance gap, constructing it from split poles that could be lifted aside when needed and replaced to close the opening. Thomas began thinking through the physics of what he had created, trying to understand exactly why it should work. He wasn't educated in formal science, but he understood practical principles from observation and experience. Heat moved in 3 ways: through direct contact, through air movement, and through radiation. His firewood wall would affect all 3. The wall blocked wind, eliminating the convective cooling that stripped heat from his cabin walls. The air gap between the firewood and cabin created a buffer zone where air could warm slightly before contacting the cabin itself. The mass of the firewood would also matter. During daylight hours, sun hitting the south-facing side of the firewood wall would warm the wood. That warmth would radiate inward toward the cabin and release slowly during the night. Thousands of pounds of wood held considerable heat, and that heat would stay trapped in the sheltered zone instead of being blown away by wind. The cabin sat in the center of a heat-retaining system, insulated not by thick walls, but by protected air and thermal mass surrounding it. Thomas installed temperature monitoring inside and outside the wall. He carved marks on wooden sticks and placed them at specific locations, one outside the firewood wall exposed to weather, one in the gap between wall and cabin, and one inside the cabin itself. By observing when water froze at each location, he could roughly measure temperature differences. The system was crude, but would provide useful data. He wanted to know if his theory was correct, if the firewood wall actually created measurable warmth differences. He also calculated fuel consumption. The firewood wall represented approximately 11 cords of wood. If he burned wood at his normal winter rate, that quantity would last roughly 3 winters. But if the wall made his cabin warmer, he would burn less fuel, potentially extending the wall's life to 4 or even 5 years. As he used wood from the wall, he would replace it with newly cut pieces, maintaining the barrier while cycling through his fuel supply. The first snow came on October 12th, earlier than usual. Thomas watched it fall from inside his cabin, noting how the snowflakes behaved differently in the sheltered zone between his firewood wall and the cabin. Outside the wall, wind drove the snow horizontally, creating drifts and swirls. Inside the perimeter, snow fell almost vertically, settling gently on the ground. The difference was visible and immediate. His firewood wall was already affecting weather patterns in the small zone it protected. Thomas had prepared thoroughly for winter. He had processed all his pelts from the previous season and organized his trapping equipment. His food supplies were stocked and inventoried. He had cut an additional 3 cords of firewood beyond what was stacked in his wall, storing it inside the perimeter for convenient access. Everything was ready. Now he simply needed to wait for the real cold to arrive and test whether his months of labor had been worthwhile or wasted. Other trappers passing through on their way to winter camps stopped to examine the completed structure. Most remained skeptical. One trapper named William Carse spent an hour walking around the perimeter, studying the construction carefully. He asked detailed questions about stability, snow load, and collapse risk. Thomas answered honestly, explaining his stacking technique and the interlocking pattern that distributed weight. Carse admitted the construction was solid, but questioned whether it would make any real difference to cabin temperature. He predicted the wood would simply absorb cold and make the problem worse. November brought moderate cold and light snow. Thomas burned small fires, just enough to keep the cabin comfortable, and monitored his temperature markers. Inside the cabin, water in a tin cup took noticeably longer to freeze than he remembered from previous winters. The difference wasn't dramatic, but it was measurable. He was using less firewood than normal for November, maintaining comfort with smaller fires. The early results suggested his system was working, though he knew the real test would come when severe cold arrived. He established his winter routine, checking trap lines, processing catches, maintaining equipment, and monitoring the firewood wall's performance. The wall required minimal maintenance. Occasionally, a piece would settle or shift, and Thomas would adjust it. Snow accumulated on top of the stacked wood, but didn't cause problems. The structure was stable and doing its job. Wind that previously would have hammered directly against his cabin walls was now breaking apart against thousands of pounds of stacked firewood. December arrived with temperatures dropping steadily. Thomas continued his temperature observations. On December 8th, when the outside temperature dropped to 5 degrees above zero, he lit a moderate fire and waited. By evening, the cabin interior was genuinely warm. warmer than he had ever experienced in previous winters with equivalent fire size. His breath wasn't forming clouds. The walls didn't have frost forming on their interior surfaces. He was comfortable wearing a single layer of wool clothing instead of his usual multiple layers. Something was working, though Thomas wouldn't make conclusions until the truly severe cold arrived. January brought the weather Thomas had been anticipating and dreading. On January 16, 1875, a massive cold system moved south from Canada. The temperature dropped throughout the afternoon, falling rapidly as the sun set. By midnight, Thomas estimated it was approaching 20 degrees below zero, based on how the air felt when he briefly stepped outside to check his temperature markers. By dawn the next morning, the cold was severe enough that simply breathing outside caused pain in his chest and throat. Thomas woke to a cabin that felt remarkably comfortable. He had kept a small fire burning through the night, feeding it once around midnight. The fire was modest, consuming far less wood than he would have burned during previous severe cold snaps. Yet the cabin interior was warm enough that he could dress without rushing, could walk around without his breath forming clouds, could touch the cabin walls without feeling intense cold radiating through the logs. He checked his temperature markers, starting inside the cabin. Water in the interior monitoring cup showed no ice. He opened the door and stepped into the gap between cabin and firewood wall. The cold hit him immediately, but it was different from standing in open wind. The air was still, protected from wind, noticeably less brutal than exposed conditions. His marker in this zone showed partial ice formation. He walked to one of the gaps in his firewood wall and stepped outside the perimeter. The cold was punishing. Wind drove against him with physical force, stealing his breath, penetrating through his coat instantly. His exposed skin hurt within seconds. The temperature marker outside the wall showed solid ice. Thomas quickly retreated back inside the perimeter, then into his cabin. The difference between the three zones was obvious and measurable. Outside the wall was brutal. Inside the perimeter but outside the cabin was cold but manageable. Inside the cabin was genuinely warm. Over the next 3 days, the severe cold continued. Thomas monitored his firewood consumption carefully. He was burning approximately 1/3 the wood he would have used during previous severe cold periods. The cabin maintained comfortable temperatures with fires that were almost modest. He didn't need to wake multiple times per night to feed enormous fires. He didn't spend his days huddled directly beside the fireplace. He could work at his table processing pelts, could sleep without multiple blankets, could move freely around the cabin interior without suffering from cold. On the 4th day, the weather broke slightly, temperatures rising to 10 below zero. Thomas decided to visit William Carse, who had a cabin 8 miles northeast. He wanted to compare conditions and confirm what he was experiencing wasn't somehow unique to this particular cold snap. The journey took 3 hours through deep snow. When he arrived at Carse's cabin, he found the trapper burning a massive fire, wearing heavy coats inside his cabin, and still complaining about the cold. Carse was astonished when Thomas described conditions at his own cabin. He didn't believe that Thomas was staying warm with small fires until Thomas invited him to visit and verify personally. William Carse arrived at Thomas's cabin on January 22nd, bringing his own thermometer and a skeptical attitude. The day was bitterly cold, with temperatures around 15 degrees below zero and steady wind from the northwest. Carse had walked the 8 miles from his own cabin wrapped in multiple layers, arriving half frozen despite constant movement. Thomas met him at the gap in the firewood wall and led him into the sheltered perimeter. Carse stopped immediately, looking around with visible surprise at how calm the air was inside the wooden barrier. Inside the cabin, Carse removed his outer layers and stood near the fireplace. Thomas's fire was moderate-sized, nothing unusual. Yet the cabin was genuinely warm. Kars walked around the interior space, touching the walls, checking for any unusual construction features. He found nothing. The cabin was standard mountain construction, identical to his own. The only difference was the firewood wall outside. Kars pulled out his thermometer and placed it on the table, waiting for it to register stable temperature. After 15 minutes, Kars's thermometer read 42 degrees inside Thomas's cabin. Kars stared at the reading, then checked the thermometer carefully to confirm it was working properly. He walked outside briefly to expose the instrument to outside air, watching it drop rapidly. He brought it back inside and watched it climb again to the low 40s. The reading was accurate. Thomas's cabin was maintaining temperatures more than 50 degrees warmer than the outside air, with a fire that consumed perhaps 1/4 the wood that Kars was burning in his own cabin. Kars spent the afternoon examining the firewood wall from multiple angles. He walked the entire perimeter, studying the stacking technique, testing stability, measuring the gap between wall and cabin. He asked detailed questions about construction time, wood quantity, and structural principles. Thomas explained his thinking about wind elimination, thermal mass, and protected air zones. Kars listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions. His skepticism was fading, replaced by genuine interest and a growing realization that Thomas had solved a fundamental problem. Before leaving, Kars asked if Thomas would help him build a similar wall around his own cabin. Thomas agreed, explaining the techniques he had developed. Kars left as the sun was setting, walking back toward his own cold cabin with new understanding. Thomas watched him disappear into the forest, knowing that word would spread. Kars wasn't the type to keep quiet about something this significant. Other trappers would hear about the impossible warmth Thomas had achieved, and they would want to know how. Over the next 2 weeks, 3 more trappers visited Thomas's cabin. Each went through the same process: initial skepticism, then amazement at the actual temperature difference, followed by detailed examination of the firewood wall construction. Each visitor asked questions about building techniques, time requirements, and wood quantities. Thomas shared everything freely. He had no interest in keeping the methods secret. If other men could stay warmer and safer through mountain winters, that was valuable, regardless of whether Thomas received credit. Marcus Hendricks was the 5th trapper to visit Thomas's cabin that winter, arriving in early February during a period of moderate cold. Unlike the previous visitors who had come primarily out of curiosity, Hendricks brought paper and pencil, intending to document exactly how the firewood wall system worked. He was an educated man, unusual among mountain trappers, having attended 2 years of university before family financial troubles sent him west. He approached Thomas's innovation with scientific interest rather than mere practical observation. Thomas spent an entire afternoon explaining his system to Hendricks, walking him through not just the construction, but the reasoning behind each element. They started outside the firewood wall, where Hendricks noted how wind hit the stacked wood barrier and broke apart, creating turbulent eddies that dissipated energy rather than transferring it directly to the cabin structure. The firewood absorbed the wind's force, protecting everything behind it. They moved into the gap between wall and cabin, and Thomas explained the protected air zone concept. This space allowed air to exist without wind constantly stripping it away and replacing it with fresh, cold air. During daylight hours, any sun hitting the cabin walls or the inner face of the firewood barrier warmed this trapped air slightly. At night, the warmed air stayed in place rather than being blown away, creating an insulation buffer that standard cabins lacked completely. Hendricks measured the gap width at multiple points, confirming Thomas had maintained consistent 3.5-foot spacing around the entire perimeter. He asked why that specific distance, and Thomas explained his reasoning. Wide enough for comfortable access and air circulation to prevent moisture problems. Narrow enough that the protected zone remained effective and didn't require excessive quantities of firewood to enclose. Inside the cabin, Thomas described the thermal mass principle. The firewood wall contained roughly 11 cords of wood, weighing approximately 15,000 pounds. That mass absorbed heat during the day, particularly on the south-facing side where sun exposure was greatest. Wood was a relatively poor conductor of heat, which meant it released absorbed warmth slowly over many hours. Throughout each night, the firewood wall gradually released stored heat into the protected air zone, maintaining warmer temperatures than would exist if the cabin stood exposed to open air. Hendricks filled several pages with notes and sketches. He drew the cabin from above, showing the firewood wall perimeter, the air gap, and the cabin structure. He noted measurements, stacking patterns, and Thomas's observations about temperature differences. He asked about construction time, and Thomas estimated he had invested approximately 400 hours of labor over 4 months, plus the ongoing time required to fell and split the trees initially. The conversation turned to fuel efficiency. Thomas explained that he was burning roughly 1/3 the firewood he had consumed in previous winters, despite maintaining much warmer interior temperatures. The firewood wall was fuel storage, but it was also infrastructure that reduced total fuel consumption. Even accounting for the time spent building it, Thomas was saving labor overall because he wasn't cutting and splitting as much wood each winter to keep warm. Marcus Hendricks left Thomas's cabin with his detailed notes and returned to the trading post at Flathead Lake in late February. The trading post served as the information hub for trappers across the Northern Territory, and Hendricks shared what he had learned with anyone who would listen. His educated perspective and methodical documentation gave credibility to claims that other trappers might have dismissed as exaggeration. He showed his sketches, explained the physics as Thomas had described it, and reported actual temperature measurements he had taken during his visit. The reaction split along predictable lines. Older trappers who had spent decades surviving mountain winters using traditional methods were skeptical and sometimes hostile. They viewed the firewood wall as unnecessary complexity, a solution to a problem that didn't need solving. Younger trappers, and those who had experienced close calls with freezing, were intensely interested. Several announced plans to build firewood walls around their own cabins before the next winter. Arguments broke out about whether the system actually worked, or whether Thomas had simply gotten lucky with weather patterns or cabin placement. William Carse, who had visited Thomas earlier in the winter, supported Hendricks's account. He described his own experience measuring temperature at Thomas's cabin and confirmed the dramatic difference compared to standard construction. Carse announced he would build a firewood wall around his cabin that summer and invited other skeptical trappers to visit the following winter to verify results themselves. His endorsement carried weight because he was known as practical and honest, not given to exaggeration or foolish ideas. By March, Thomas's firewood wall had become the primary topic of conversation throughout the trapping community. Men who had never met Thomas were discussing his construction techniques, debating the physics involved, and arguing about whether the labor investment was worthwhile. Some trappers who lived too far away to visit decided to try the technique based purely on descriptions. Others planned visits to Thomas's cabin specifically to examine the structure before committing their own labor to similar projects. Thomas remained isolated at his cabin through March, unaware of the debates happening at the trading post. He continued his normal winter routine, checking traps, processing pelts, and maintaining his equipment. The firewood wall required minimal attention beyond occasionally adjusting pieces that had settled under snow load. He was comfortable, warm, and burning far less wood than previous winters. The system worked exactly as he had hoped, and that was sufficient for him. In early April, as winter began breaking, Thomas received an unusual number of visitors. Trappers traveling through the area made deliberate detours to examine his cabin. Some asked for detailed construction advice. Others simply wanted to see the structure for themselves, verifying that it existed and was as described. Thomas welcomed each visitor, answered questions patiently, and shared his techniques freely, He had no proprietary interest in the method and saw no reason to withhold information that might help other men survive mountain winters more safely. One visitor, a trapper named James Sullivan, spent 3 days at Thomas's cabin in mid-April, learning every detail of the construction process. James Sullivan returned to his own camp 40 miles south of Thomas's location and immediately began building a firewood wall around his cabin. Sullivan had experienced a difficult winter, burning through nearly all his firewood supply and still barely maintaining livable temperatures during the coldest weeks. Thomas's system offered a solution Sullivan desperately needed. He started cutting trees in late April, working with the intensity of a man who had glimpsed something that might save his life in winters to come. Sullivan's cabin was located along a travel route used by multiple trappers, which meant his construction project had an audience. Trappers passing through stopped to watch him work, ask questions, and debate whether the effort was worthwhile. Sullivan explained the physics as Thomas had described it, showed sketches he had drawn during his stay at Thomas's cabin, and continued working regardless of whether observers were convinced. By early June, his firewood wall was beginning to take shape, and even skeptical observers admitted the construction was solid and substantial. William Carse began his own firewood wall in May, documenting the construction process carefully. Carse was methodical by nature, and he approached the project as an experiment rather than just cabin improvement. He kept records of time spent, trees felled, and construction details. He planned to compare his winter fuel consumption and temperature measurements against previous years, creating data that would definitively prove or disprove the system's effectiveness. Other trappers knew of Carse's reputation for honest reporting, and many were waiting to hear his results before committing their own labor. By midsummer of 1875, at least 7 trappers were building firewood walls around their cabins across the northern Montana territory. Each builder adapted the basic concept to his specific situation. Some built walls slightly higher or lower than Thomas's original. Others adjusted the gap width based on available space. A few experimented with different stacking patterns, but the core principle remained consistent. Create a substantial firewood barrier around the cabin to eliminate wind and create protected air zones. The trapping community began referring to the structures as fortress cabins or firewood fortresses. The name captured both the appearance, cabins surrounded by wooden walls, and the function of protection against winter's assault. Some trappers who built the walls reported unexpected benefits beyond warmth. The protected perimeter made excellent storage space for equipment, tools, and supplies. The barrier provided security against curious wildlife. The sheltered zone allowed outdoor work during weather that would otherwise be impossible. Not everyone adopted the technique. Many trappers continued using traditional cabin construction, either because they were satisfied with existing methods, skeptical of the new approach, or unwilling to invest the substantial labor required. The firewood fortress remained controversial, with strong advocates and equally strong critics. But the debate itself ensured the technique spread rapidly through the trapping community. Even trappers who chose not to build firewood walls knew about them, understood the principles involved, and had opinions about their effectiveness. The winter of 1875 to 1876 provided definitive proof of the firewood wall's effectiveness. Thomas Brennan, William Carse, James Sullivan, and 4 other trappers who had built firewood fortresses that summer all reported similar results. Their cabins maintained temperatures 45 to 55 degrees warmer than outside air during severe cold, and they consumed roughly 1/3 the firewood compared to previous winters. The temperature differences were measurable, consistent, and undeniable. Skeptics who visited these cabins during cold weather became converts upon experiencing the warmth firsthand. William Carse's documented data proved particularly influential. He had kept meticulous records comparing his previous winter's fuel consumption and estimated cabin temperatures against the winter spent with his firewood wall. His cabin had been significantly warmer while burning 62% less wood. Kars shared his findings at the trading post in spring of 1876, and his methodical documentation convinced many trappers who had remained skeptical. The Firewood fortress wasn't speculation or luck. It was proven technology that worked consistently across different locations and conditions. By summer of 1876, the technique had spread beyond the immediate Montana territory. Trappers traveling to Wyoming, Idaho, and even parts of Canada carried descriptions of firewood wall construction. Some travelers had visited Thomas's cabin or other early adopters, while others worked from second-hand descriptions and rough sketches. The technique continued evolving as different builders adapted it to local conditions, available materials, and personal preferences. Some built walls from stone where wood was scarce. Others created hybrid designs using both stacked firewood and vertical log posts. The phrase, "built like a firewood fortress," entered common usage throughout the Rocky Mountain trapping communities. It became shorthand for construction that prioritized protection against winter conditions, that showed careful planning and substantial labor investment, and that actually worked when tested by severe weather. Trappers used the phrase as a compliment, indicating respect for someone who had built properly, rather than accepting minimal standards. Thomas Brennan continued trapping through 1877, but the declining fur market and his own aging made the work increasingly difficult. He was 36 years old, had survived 11 winters in the mountains, and had saved enough money to consider alternatives. In spring of 1878, he sold his cabin and trap lines to a younger trapper from Ohio. The sale included the structure itself, the firewood wall, and all the trap lines Thomas had established over his years in the territory. The buyer specifically mentioned the Firewood fortress as a primary reason he was willing to pay premium price for the property. Thomas traveled west to Oregon, purchased land in the Willamette Valley, and established a small farm. He married in 1879 and started a family. His life became ordinary, focused on crops and livestock rather than beaver pelts and winter survival. He rarely spoke about his years in the mountains, and when he did, he never mentioned the firewood wall that had made him briefly famous among Rocky Mountain trappers. Thomas Brennan died in 1903 at age 61, buried in a cemetery outside Salem, Oregon. His obituary mentioned his farm, his family, and his service to the local community. It made no reference to his years as a mountain trapper or his innovation that had changed winter survival across the northern Rockies. His children knew their father had worked in Montana before settling in Oregon, but they never learned the details of what he had accomplished there. In the mountains Thomas had left behind, his legacy persisted in wood and stone. The cabin he had built still stood in 1890, 43 years after he first arrived in Montana. The firewood wall had been maintained and rebuilt multiple times by successive occupants, each generation of trappers understanding its value and preserving the structure. Travelers who found the cabin during that era reported it was still remarkably warm, still used the same basic design Thomas had created, and still demonstrated the principles he had discovered through grief and obsessive problem-solving. The firewood fortress technique spread far beyond Thomas's original implementation. By the 1880s, variations of the concept appeared throughout the Rocky Mountains and Northern Plains regions. Homesteaders building in exposed locations used firewood walls to protect not just cabins, but also barns and outbuildings. Remote trading posts adopted the technique for their storage buildings. Army outposts in harsh climates experimented with similar windbreak systems. The core idea, that substantial barriers creating protected air zones could dramatically improve winter survival, became accepted wisdom in frontier construction. Historians attempting to trace the technique's origins found conflicting accounts. Some attributed it to various trappers whose names had been associated with early builds. Others claimed it was traditional knowledge from Scandinavian settlers. A few suggested it had been independently discovered by multiple builders facing similar problems. Thomas Brennan's name appeared in some early accounts but faded from most histories. The innovation outlived its inventor's recognition, becoming anonymous knowledge passed between practical men who needed solutions more than they needed attribution. Modern researchers studying frontier survival techniques occasionally encounter references to firewood fortresses in trappers' journals and letters from the 1870s and 80s. The descriptions are often brief, assuming readers already understand the concept. Archaeological surveys of abandoned cabin sites in Montana and Wyoming have documented several structures showing evidence of perimeter firewood walls. Gaps in surrounding ground indicating where massive wood stacks once stood, patterns of soil discoloration marking protected zones, and cabin remains showing minimal weather damage suggesting unusual protection. The impossible had become routine. A cabin maintaining 50-degree temperature differentials wasn't remarkable. It was expected from proper construction. The knowledge spread silently, carpenter to carpenter, trapper to settler, father to son. Thomas Brennan's obsession with understanding why his brother had frozen had created a technique that saved uncounted lives over decades. The mathematics of warmth he had discovered through grief and experimentation became foundational knowledge for anyone building shelter in the coldest regions of the American frontier.